Good evening, and welcome to tonight's Mansfield Dialogue on Taiwan, a democracy and a technological powerhouse located about 100 miles off the coast of China, which is about the same distance as between Cuba and Florida. I'm Joanna Shelton, and I'm a member of the board of the Marine and Mike Mansfield Center at the University of Montana. I'm very pleased to moderate tonight's discussion. The Mansfield Center was founded by an act of Congress in 1983. It fosters globally minded leaders of integrity in honor of the late Senator and Ambassador Mike Mansfield and his wife, Maureen Hayes Mansfield. The Mansfield Center acknowledges that we are in the Aboriginal territories of the Salish and Kalispel people. We honor their history and culture and the path that they have carved in showing us how to care for this place that we all call home. I am very, very pleased to welcome tonight's speaker, Dr. Shelley Rigger of Davidson College in North Carolina. She is one of the country's foremost experts on Taiwan and US-Taiwan relations, and we're really honored to have her with us tonight. I first met Shelley at our once annual conferences on US-China relations that were held in Shanghai, but I haven't seen her in a number of years, and so it's really wonderful to see her here tonight, even virtually. Dr. Rigger is the Brown Professor of East Asian Politics and Vice President for Academic Affairs, as well as Dean of the faculty at Davidson College. So she carries quite a heavy responsibility at the college. She has a PhD in government from Harvard University and a BA in public and international affairs from Princeton University. She has been a Fulbright scholar at leading universities in Taiwan and is widely published, including books and articles on Taiwan's domestic politics, its economic prowess, and other matters. In addition to her publications, she is a non-resident fellow of the China Policy Institute at Nottingham University in the United Kingdom. She's a senior fellow of the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia. And she is a director of the Taiwan Fund, which is an investment fund specializing in Taiwan-listed companies. So she clearly has a diverse and extensive background to help us understand more about Taiwan and US-Taiwan relations. And you will see that there is a fuller biography of Dr. Rigger being posted in the chat box right now. Now, our plan tonight is Dr. Rigger will give opening remarks of about 15 minutes. After that, we'll have a Q&A session, which will include my own questions that have already been submitted by some of you, and then any new questions that you may have as our discussion proceeds. If you'd like to ask a question, just type your question in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get to as many as possible before we conclude at 8 o'clock. So with that, Shelley, I turn it over to you.
All right. Well, thank you so much. It is really a pleasure to see you again after all these years. It's really sad to think about how difficult it has been in the last few years to return to Shanghai, where we first met and spent a lot of really nice time together. And it's also a little sad and worrying to think about how long it may yet be before we get back to Shanghai. So I've got some emotion seeing you again, but it is certainly with great pleasure, and with great pleasure to be able to speak to your audience tonight. So where I thought I would begin, just to get this conversation rolling, is with a quick overview of how we got to where we are in US-China-Taiwan relations, where I think we are right now, and maybe a little bit about where things may be headed. So how did we get here? I think it's worth starting with a little bit of a review of Taiwan's history. So Taiwan is an island off the coast of the Chinese mainland, and in kind of prehistoric times, It was the home of indigenous peoples who are still in Taiwan today. They're about 2% of Taiwan's population. But the rest of Taiwan's population, for the most part, are people who migrated to the island from the Chinese mainland over the centuries from about the mid-early 1600s until the end of the 19th century. In 1895, Taiwan became a colony of Japan. And so for 50 years, it was part of the Japanese Empire. In 1945, when the Japanese Empire was defeated and came to a crashing end at the end of World War II, the island of Taiwan was handed over by the Allied powers to the then government of China, which we will remember as the nationalist government under the leadership of Chiang Kai-shek. The nationalists established in Taiwan an authoritarian state in which those who had come to Taiwan with the nationalists in the 1940s, who were only about 15% of the population, established their leadership over the rest of the Taiwanese people. So beginning in the 1940s and 50s, Taiwan became a kind of really a military dictatorship or a single party dictatorship under the nationalists. The nationalists then, have taken a lot of criticism for their political policies over the early decades in the post-war period. But their economic policies were very successful. And under the leadership of the nationalists, Taiwan became a real economic and manufacturing powerhouse. And that's why people of a certain age in the United States remember Made in Taiwan as, the sticker that was on everything we ever played with as children. Lots of electronic devices in the 1960s and 70s were all made in Taiwan. In the 1970s, Taiwan's political atmosphere began to change, in part because the global community was less supportive of the nationalists than they had been. In particular, the US was no longer willing to uphold the nationalists and their authoritarianism because they were anti-communist. The US was opening relations with the People's Republic of China. And so it was no longer enough for Taiwan just to be an anti-communist friend to the US in the region. So people in Taiwan, recognizing that the legitimacy of the nationalists was beginning to waver internationally, began pressing for domestic political change. And in the 80s and 90s, Taiwan underwent a democratic transition and became what we know it to be today, which is a vibrant multi-party democracy. What that means for US-Taiwan relations is that while the original rationale for Taiwan's relationship with the US kind of disappeared, it no longer was part of that Cold War division between the communist world and the Western world. Taiwan suddenly had a new reason, a new claim on American support, which was it was a democracy and continues to be so. And also the US and Taiwan have had this very fruitful economic cooperation over the past few decades. And that cooperation has continued into the present era as Taiwan has developed a really spectacular high-tech economy since the 1990s. So recently we've heard a lot about semiconductors and the chip shortage and the need for the US to increase the supply of microchips. Taiwan has been a big player in the middle of all of that because Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, or TSMC, is the world's leading producer of semiconductors, especially at the very high end of the technology ladder. So where are we now? I think if we think about where we are today from Taiwan's point of view, the sort of center of gravity in Taiwan is that while most Taiwanese are cautious and do not want to do anything that might create a crisis with Beijing, they also would prefer not to be folded into the People's Republic of China. And the People's Republic of China's goal is to incorporate Taiwan into that country. So in Taiwan, the major, the sort of predominant point of view is, let's keep things the way they are now. We're governed separately because the nationalist government has evolved since the end of World War II, but has never been replaced by a government from mainland China since the end of the war. So we'd like to keep things the way they are. We'd like to have our own government, be governed separately, but also continue to have peaceful and actually economically beneficial relations with mainland China. From the PRC's perspective, this outcome is not good enough. The PRC government would like to incorporate Taiwan fully into the People's Republic of China, and especially over the last 6 years, since 2016, the mainland China government, so the PRC government, has pretty much cut off normal relations with Taiwan. So no longer talking to Taiwanese entities, including some representatives of the Taiwan government, as they had done prior to 2012. And the reason that the PRC cut off communication with Taiwan's authorities is that in 2016, a president was elected in Taiwan who the Chinese leaders believe is seeking to separate Taiwan from China permanently and make that unification, or make the incorporation of Taiwan into China, impossible forever. So they don't like the Taiwanese president, and they are not talking. Meanwhile, the relationship between the United States and China has been deteriorating sharply in the last few years. And that has kind of put Taiwan more at the center of the conversation between Washington and Beijing, with a lot of people in Washington looking at Taiwan as a kind of a stopper in the bottle of Chinese power, and a lot of people in China seeing the US as the reason that their ambitions with respect to Taiwan are being frustrated. So finally, just to say a word about President Xi Jinping, who has just been reappointed as the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party for a third term, which almost certainly means that he will be reappointed as the state chairman of the PRC. His actual title is not president, but state chairman. To say a little something about Xi Jinping, he's really been leaning in on Taiwan much more intensely than was the case even prior to 2021. Things got worse in 2016, but they've been getting progressively worse in the last few years. And I think that's for a few reasons. First of all, within China, the Taiwan issue is a high priority because Chinese leaders have made it a high priority. For the last 20 or 30 years, one after another Chinese leader has said, we have to solve this problem. We have to reincorporate Taiwan. And by making that such a strong priority, they have kind of put themselves in a position where they can't afford to fail. So it is increasingly urgent to the leaders in Beijing, at a minimum, not to see things get worse. The second reason I think Xi Jinping is leaning in on Taiwan more in the last couple of years is that China's ability to rise internationally and to take a bigger role in the international community increases the desire to show strength on international issues. And Taiwan is the most immediate international issue for the PRC. And that's why I think they're looking to really show the world that they're not going to back down on this very important issue. And it's especially important not to back down because it's the United States that the Chinese leadership believes is in the way of China getting what it wants with respect to Taiwan. So as US-China relations get worse, Beijing's determination to show strength on this issue only increases. So that kind of brings us up to the present, and I'm happy to clarify any of the details there, but that's my quick 15-minute summary of the dawn of time to the present in the Taiwan Strait.
Well, it's fascinating, and you did a great job of giving us a lot of material there and a lot to think about and talk about. I'm going to throw out a sort of general question that has come from one of our listeners from Missoula, Montana, which is, we've got a lot going on in the world. We've got Russia invading Ukraine, all these problems that we see in the world today. Tell people why Americans should care about Taiwan and these rising tensions. I mean, what is the significance for the United States and the world?
This is a really critical question, right? This is what we really have to think through in order to make good decisions. At the moment in the US, there's a lot of support for the idea that why Taiwan matters to the United States is because the Chinese leadership wants Taiwan. The US is threatened by China, and so the US should stop China from getting Taiwan. And this, I think, is the wrong reason for, I don't think that's why Taiwan matters to the US, because I think that puts Taiwan in the position of being a kind of tool or even weapon in US-China relations, when why Taiwan really matters to the US is that Taiwan is an example of how American values and American institutions can be good for people in a country, good for people in a region, good for the entire human family, right? Taiwan started out as an impoverished dictatorship with very little technological contribution to the world, and has blossomed into a liberal democracy with very high levels of freedom and political participation. Social justice is important to people in Taiwan. And at the same time, it has a powerhouse of an economy that is creating new technological solutions to problems facing the world every day. So I think really, rather than seeing Taiwan as a kind of tool that we can use to frustrate China's ambitions, we should see Taiwan as an end in itself and as a human community that has thrived and flourished and is delivering a lot of value to the world. One other reason that Taiwan matters to the US that I think is also worth mentioning is how the US manages its relationship with Taiwan and China matters a lot for other allies in the region. So if the US is unable or unwilling to defend Taiwan, it may lose the confidence of people in Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and beyond, who up to now have been counting on the US as a partner in their own national security.
Great answer, and great answer. We have sort of staying in the question of Taiwan's evolution that you have described, from a dictatorship and a authoritarian regime to now a thriving democracy. There are two questions that have come in. One is in the Q&A box now, and I'll read it, and then the one that had come in previously. A listener right now asks, since the start of the US-China trade tensions, there's been an increasing amount of discussion regarding how policymakers could have mistakenly believed that China would liberalize politically if it had reformed economically and entered the WTO. And I was part of that discussion, and I recall that discussion and that point of view very, very well. Continuing, it says, since Taiwan did follow that path, first of economic reform and later political reform and political pluralization, why do you think Taiwan was able to change from a similar one-party state under Chiang Kai-shek to a democracy when China wasn't? And a second question, somewhat related, is how has Taiwan managed to stay free all these years? Is it US and worldwide support only? So, Shelley, what is your take on these?
Yeah, wow, those are really challenging. All right. I think the experience of the world in the 1970s and 80s was that when societies reached a certain level of economic development and social modernization, people started pushing for more political participation and more civil and human rights. And that trend was pretty widespread internationally. It certainly wasn't universal, but we saw it in Europe, we saw it in Latin America, we saw it in parts of Asia. So it's not terribly surprising that people began to think it was an immutable pattern or like a law of politics. Nonetheless, if you go back and you read what US policymakers were saying during the 90s and the 2000s, when they were advocating for China to be incorporated into international economic institutions in particular, they never said this is inevitable, it's automatic that China is going to go democratic. What they said is there's no chance that China will democratize as long as it does not develop economically. And so I think what we've seen is that it is possible to have a lot of economic growth without political change. And that's an important lesson. I am not convinced, though, that a poor or underdeveloped or excluded China would be any less of a challenge internationally than the China we see today. Because one of the things that has happened to China and in China in the last 3 decades is that it has become very intertwined with the international institutions and very interdependent with other countries. And that actually contributes to how I could answer the second question, which is part of the reason Taiwan is still free is definitely that the US has stepped in to show support for Taiwan at critical moments. So like in 1995, when there was the PRC used military pressure to kind of intimidate people in Taiwan in the run-up to their very first direct presidential elections, the US stepped in with military gestures to kind of say, whoa, wait a minute, this is, we're not going to just let China intimidate Taiwan or coerce Taiwan. And that same pattern has repeated since, including this summer when the PRC was ratcheting up military pressure on Taiwan. So I don't want to discount. Also, the US has supplied Taiwan with lots and lots of defensive weapons over the decades. So that's important. But I also think the Chinese government is moderated in its ambition by the knowledge that Taiwanese people are huge contributors to the Chinese economy, and that there are massive economic costs as well as military costs and risks if China actually blows up its relationship with Taiwan. So Taiwanese are among the top investors in mainland China, and many of China's most important companies that export massive amounts of especially high-tech devices to the world are actually owned by Taiwanese and could not really operate without a strong connection, a strong economic connection. So I think it's largely the military support that the US has given Taiwan, also the political protection that the US gives Taiwan by not allowing China to completely erase Taiwan from the international community. But I think Chinese leaders also know that they have a lot to lose if Taiwan ceases to be a kind of going concern economically and politically.
I think you're right. In fact, that's one of the questions that came in from the audience as well. And one of the points I would add, having been involved in U.S.-China relations during the 90s and being involved in China's entry into the WTO, is if you looked around the world and you looked at countries, Korea, so many countries that had authoritarian regimes or military-driven regimes, and that developed a thriving middle class with more exposure to outside ideas and more freedoms economically, the vast preponderance of those countries moved from authoritarian regimes to democracies in one form or another. So I think it wasn't unreasonable, too, to think that this is a trend that we had seen played out in other countries. Certainly, China was a very different country, much bigger. And we have seen that now under Xi Jinping, of course, they are reversing a lot of the reforms that they had put in place. But yeah, I think that we now look back and say, how could people have been so blind? And yet the trends certainly had moved in that direction. I think what I'd like to do now is turn more explicitly to, I think, a question or concern that's uppermost on most people's mind, and that is whether China, under a newly strengthened Xi Jinping, will move militarily to unite Taiwan with China, despite the economic risks. Some people say, well, look at Xi Jinping, what he is doing to clamp down on economic activity within China, on the high-tech sector, on billionaires, et cetera. He's harming in the economy. He doesn't seem to care because he wants to put the Chinese Communist Party first. So questions would be, is the United States likely to respond militarily if China invades Taiwan? I mean, President Biden has issued some mixed signals in that regard. How can the United States best navigate the difficult Taiwan and China relationship? And then finally, from a listener in, I believe, Cleveland, we are outnumbered, outgunned, short on weapons, and short on guts. Would it not be better now to make some kind of deal, I guess, with China and Taiwan to just avoid this whole risk altogether? Shelley.
All right. Lots of good questions packed in there. I guess the first thing I would say is I was recently listening to a wonderful podcast, the Sinica podcast that comes out of the China Project. And they were doing a wrap up after the 20th Party Congress in Beijing. And one of the speakers said, this is pretty close to a direct quote. He said, I still think the Chinese leadership looks at Taiwan as a crisis to be avoided, not an opportunity to be exploited. And I agree with that position. The risk of military action against Taiwan is incredibly high. The economic risk is incredibly high, not just to China, but to the whole world. And the military risk for China is really high. The People's Liberation Army, so the Chinese military forces, have not fought a war in a long time. They had a short little one in 1979, but before that, you have to go back to the 1950s, and even before, really. So they don't have a lot of direct military experience. They do have a lot of, they've spent a lot of money modernizing their forces, both in terms of hardware and personnel, but it's untested, and war throws surprises at you. I think the Russians have really learned that, demonstrated that in Ukraine. It is really difficult to estimate a country's military power outside of a conflict scenario, and it's really easy for things to go in unexpected directions. And for the Chinese leadership, the only thing worse than not managing to bring Taiwan back into the PRC fold is to try and fail, right? So it's very risky, and it's not something that is actually necessary for China to thrive. Ideologically, it's very important to the leadership, and they have told their people it should be important to you. But the Chinese economy has become what it is, not in spite of Taiwan being separate, but because Taiwan is separate, right? If Taiwan had not been able to develop its own economy separately from what was happening in mainland China under Mao Zedong and the early Deng Xiaoping era, you'd just have a poor and underdeveloped China next to a poor and underdeveloped Taiwan. But because Taiwan's economy was so strong, Taiwanese investors were able to contribute a lot to the development of mainland China, especially export manufacturing, which was just not going to happen in mainland China without foreign direct investment and without companies coming in who had the ability to sell into global supply chains. And most of that investment came from Taiwan. So, China has thrived because Taiwan was separate, not in spite of the fact that Taiwan was separate. And there's nothing that prevents China from achieving the well-being of its own people with the two sides functioning as they do today. So it's a kind of manufactured urgency and necessity, not a real urgency or necessity. So I think for all these reasons, I'm relatively optimistic that without some kind of provocation, that Beijing will find ways to keep delaying action on this issue. And here's where the US comes in. And so getting to the question about what can the US do, the US needs to avoid making up that provocation on its own side. So I think my feeling is that people in Taiwan are really cautious. They don't think China's going to attack because they can't imagine how that would be good for anybody. But they don't want to create an opportunity or a necessity for China to attack them. So they don't support activity by their own government that is likely to force China's hand. So the big thing would be some kind of declaration of independence, right? We are never going to unify with China. Forget it. Taiwan's separate forever. That would certainly provoke Chinese military response. So I think it's very unlikely. What seems more likely is that someone in the United States may create a situation that Chinese leaders interpret as a provocation. And so even if Taiwan does nothing, we can still find ourselves in a crisis if we're not careful. So my advice to the US government is do the things that really help Taiwan, like economic relations, military sales, but don't do big symbolic gestures that look good on TV, but don't actually add to Taiwan's security.
Well, and you're right. There's an awful lot of, I will almost say, saber rattling now coming out of the halls of Congress, particularly as China has become more aggressive towards Taiwan. And a lot of politicians seem to feel that for their own domestic constituencies and perhaps their national visibility, they too need to play tough on China. So it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out in the months to come. I'd like to kind of go back to something that you mentioned about Taiwan's independence, and the independence of its economy was what helped drive China's economic growth, because I had wanted to ask you about one of the publications that you have written for general readers, excuse me, and one of them is called "The Tiger Leading the Dragon: How Taiwan Propelled China's Economic Rise." And I think you've already explained largely how that happened, but I find that interesting. And I don't know if you care to expand on that a bit, because I also then, maybe I'll give you a chance to expand if you'd like. Then I'd like to just circle back a little bit to some of the domestic politics involved here in Taiwan-Chinese relations.
Sure. Yes, I would be happy to talk about my book, The Tiger Leading the Dragon. So Taiwan's economic development really began in low-tech manufacturing. So I remember, growing up with Barbie dolls with "Made in Taiwan" stamped on their legs. My brother used to listen to baseball games with a transistor radio under his pillow that was made in Taiwan. A lot of brand merchandise like Nike, Adidas, shoes, Schwinn bicycles, all kinds of things that American consumers and consumers in Europe really enjoy were made for those companies, Mattel, Schwinn, Nike, in Taiwan by Taiwanese, usually small and medium-sized manufacturers. And it's just a fascinating story how those manufacturing clusters developed in Taiwan and kind of took over toy making, shoe making, big chunks of the apparel making markets for international brands. By the late 1980s, that was getting really expensive. Taiwan was no longer a cheap place to manufacture inexpensive goods. And just at that moment, the Taiwanese government they allowed people from Taiwan to go to mainland China for the first time since 1945 or 49. So lots of Taiwanese went to the mainland, not thinking they were going to do business, but as soon as they got there, they realized, wow, this place is perfect for business. There's this huge labor force that is really underemployed because they've had 30 plus years of Maoism beating back every effort to grow an economy. So there's lots of people here. Many of them don't have jobs, or they're working, but they're not really productive. There are local governments that are desperate for investment, and they're willing to help us get electricity and land and buildings and workers. All we need to do is just bring that toy making or shoe making or clothes making equipment, set up a factory in China, and we can keep selling to Nike, we can keep selling to Mattel, but we can drop the cost of production to a fraction of what it is in Taiwan. So what you saw between 1987 and about 1992 was a massive migration of export-oriented manufacturing from Taiwan to mainland China, where a lot of those companies just got really, really, really large. At the same time, whole new industrial ideas and concepts emerged, like Foxconn, right? The iPhone assembler. Nobody ever really thought about putting a couple 100,000 people in a factory together on a giant campus to assemble electronic devices. But Foxconn, which is a Taiwanese company, realized that they could cut the cost of manufacturing electronic devices a lot if they use that Chinese manufacturing platform. So that's what I'm talking about when I say, China was able to enter global supply chains thanks to these Taiwanese companies bringing their businesses to the mainland. Meanwhile, what happens in Taiwan, right? When you lose all your manufacturing, usually that means your economy is hollowed out and in big trouble. But actually what happened in Taiwan was the Taiwanese government sponsored new industries to grow into that empty space. And that's where we get semiconductor manufacturing, LED manufacturing, and other kinds of high-tech products that really nobody was making in large quantity, and certainly not with the kind of hyper efficiency that the Taiwanese companies can achieve. So, Taiwan's economy has continued to thrive, while China's economy has also thrived in significant measure thanks to those Taiwanese companies going over there and setting up.
Yeah, I recall being in Taiwan on a number of occasions during the 1980s and 90s, the period you're talking about, and you did hear Taiwanese leaders talking about trying to establish Taiwan as really a go-between between China and American and other foreign investors and producers, saying we've got the language, we've got the capability, and so why don't you use us, and hoping that that would really be a power behind their economy. But as you say, a lot of the manufacturing simply left, and the Taiwanese were no longer in the middle so much. I'd like to shift back now just to some of the domestic politics. You are an expert on Taiwan's domestic politics, and ask you, what are some of the fault lines in Taiwan's domestic politics, particularly with respect to Taiwan's relations with China, And how does public opinion affect those trends? For example, is there much support for independence, which China has said would be a real, would provoke a firm response? One questioner asks, is Taiwan divided politically, whether to unify with China or remain free and a democracy? So can you tell us a little bit about public opinion and how the Taiwanese see themselves?
Yeah, there is a big divide in Taiwan, and sometimes the politics seems very polarized, but it's not really a divide over whether to unify with China under the Chinese plan or not. Nobody in Taiwan, or hardly anybody in Taiwan, wants to be part of the People's Republic of China in the way that Beijing or Shanghai or today even Hong Kong is part of the People's Republic of China, right? That would mean giving up their ability to choose their own leaders, and it would almost certainly mean giving up some of their personal liberties, like freedom of speech and assembly and, that kind of thing. So I don't think there are more than a handful of people in Taiwan who are really advocating that. But the difference of opinion is, if our goal is to keep things the way they are, to remain separate from the mainland, but not provoke a crisis, what's the best way to do that? And the current president and her party believe that the best way to do that is to secure the support of the United States and other friendly countries as best they can, to try to integrate Taiwan internationally and have a strong economy that lots of countries are dependent on, and kind of try to minimize their vulnerability and exposure to the PRC. The other main political party, which is the Nationalist Party, the same one that came over in 1945, believes that the best way to keep Taiwan's current status quo is to engage China and to try and have a better relationship with the Chinese leadership so that they will not worry so much that Taiwan is going to try to make a break for independence. And I think for a lot of Taiwanese citizens, it's a really tough decision because they don't want to be unified under that red and gold star flag, but they also understand that it may be very difficult to avoid some kind of negotiation forever.
Well, related to that, I guess, would be then Taiwanese attitudes about the United States, and do they feel confident that the United States would come to the aid of Taiwan if China, engaged in some kind of military aggression? Or, you have sort of these gray area aggressions as well, which are maybe not as clear cut. But how do the Taiwanese people feel? Do they feel that we would come to their assistance, or do they worry they would be left on their own? And if that were the case, then the question is, are they prepared to defend themselves militarily? So how do you see that question within Taiwan?
Yeah, the level of confidence in U.S. intervention varies over time, and it's pretty hard to pin down. So before the war in Ukraine, it was a bit higher. And then after Russia invaded Ukraine and the US did not intervene, it went down markedly, like fell by half. But now that it's clear that Ukraine can fight on with US equipment, although not US military personnel, it's kind of creeping back up. So I think on the whole, Taiwanese really don't know, and they don't want to test the US any more than they want to test Beijing. That's why gestures of support for Taiwan, though, can win a lot of enthusiasm from Taiwanese people. So, for example, when Speaker Pelosi went to Taiwan this summer, a lot of people like me in the US were critical because we said, you're going to bring down the wrath of the PLA on Taiwan just so that you can say you went. But a lot of my friends in Taiwan were really glad that she did go because they felt like this is an affirmation that Taiwan does matter to the US and that American leaders will stand up for us. So, how the US positions itself to reassure Taiwan without making Taiwan overconfident is really challenging. That is a very tricky balance to strike.
Yes, and I noticed that in the recent or foreign affairs has garnered some opinions from experts on China as to whether or not the United States should move away from our policy of strategic ambiguity, where we don't say whether we would or would not intervene militarily. And some very strongly say, yes, we should send that signal to deter China. Others, as you were just suggesting, suggest that, that really might not be, we don't want to give Taiwan any reason to feel that they can be then provocative. So you're right, it's sort of a tightrope walk. And it's pretty clear that domestic politics in the United States are going to continue to debate this, which really brings up a question. This is going to be, and we have a few more minutes here, but this one is perhaps a little tougher question for you. But the question comes, US Democrats and Republicans appear united on being tough with China, which may or may not be good. However, in Taiwan, the DPP and KMT, the two parties you've mentioned, so far have not been as united in terms of how to deal with a threat posed by China. What can the two parties here in Taiwan do to work together on key security and economic issues? So if you were advising the political parties in Taiwan, what would you tell them?
Yeah, well, wow. Thank you for tuning in from Taiwan. That's amazing. And Jiayo, glad to have you on this call. The two political parties in Taiwan need to be a little more expansive in how they think about the world, I think. I know that the situation is incredibly difficult and it's uncomfortable to offer advice or criticism of people who are managing a situation that is so incredibly delicate and also in which a mistake could be so devastating. But it does sometimes seem to me that as in the US, as in China, as in every country in the world, the focus is on domestic politics and internal politics and the competition for power within Taiwan, and not on, all right, what are we competing for? What is the purpose of winning in Taiwan? The purpose of winning is obviously to protect our country and to preserve our freedom. So the advice I have is just to kind of pause every once in a while and remind yourself that if the way that you're doing political battle is to attack your domestic opponent and to let your foreign opponent off the hook, you should probably rethink that. And I would say that for all the challenges in Taiwan domestic politics, Taiwanese are way less fratricidal than American politicians. Nobody in Taiwan is attacking one another in the way that American politicians routinely do. So, I think you got to stick together, but the way to stick together is also to kind of lift your vision out of the local and domestic and remind yourselves what's going on internationally that needs to be carefully watched and managed.
Well, and I wish we had more time because there are a few more questions, but we are running out of time. And just to say, picking up on one of your points, I think the United States has a lot to offer to other countries, but our political divisions right now are not one of those examples that we should be setting. And actually, that's something else that the Mansfield Center is now trying to bolster our work on, which is democracy and civic education, to try to, at least in our part of the world here, begin to do what we can to maybe reduce some of the horrible divisions that we are seeing and the inability to disagree without being disagreeable. So I at this point just want to thank you, Shelley. It has been fascinating. It's been wonderful to see you again, and you have shown us why you are one of the world's leading experts on Taiwan and Taiwanese politics and US-Taiwan relations. Appreciate you taking your time, particularly at this late hour for you. And of course, we have people from Taiwan and other parts of the United States and other countries joining us. I also want to thank all those viewers who did tune in, particularly, as say, at this odd hour for many of you. Then finally, just a word to say that dialogues like this would not be possible without the generous support of donors. So if you would like to continue to support dialogues like this, look for a link in the chat box that will enable you to make contributions of any size that you care to do. So Shelley, again, thank you so much. We have learned a lot and could continue, but we hope maybe we can resume this discussion maybe in a year or so and see where things are at that point. So thank you, everyone, and good night.